Yeah, I don't know if you have something you have to click, but there we go.
Yep, I'm going to hit continue. All right, shall we get going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Looks okay.
So welcome to the session on negotiation in mediation and conflict resolution. I'm just going to skip through these next pages. Bear with me while I navigate. So we're going to cover 3 segments. One is just looking at the basic. Why do people negotiate? What's the motive? And I think it's important that we understand that. So we're going to cover that briefly and also understand the different types of negotiation. Then we're going to look at negotiation and mediation and what does that look and feel like if you're a mediator, importantly. And then we're going to finish with conflict and how does that look and feel and why it's important to understand how conflict occurs. There is a lot to this, and so we're just trying to touch on some of the key takeaways. There's a lot of information in this deck, and so hopefully you received it in advance that you could have read through some of it, and if not, I really encourage you to read through the material when you get a chance, because I'm just going to talk about the takeaways and then give time as we're going to, discuss. So please just, jump in, ask questions, halt me at any point if you want to talk about anything. There's some really great resources at the back of in this deck or in the deck, the main program deck, that include citations and also a really good cross-section of, I think, the best reading material out there. And this is my research over a number of years, including 2 really great books, which I'll share at the end. Okay. So let's start with just a view of the negotiator's mindset. So again, there's a lot here. I'm just going to break it down into some key takeaways. So it's important to understand why we negotiate and what the motive is behind that. And there's some definitions there on the left-hand side. I'm not going to read those out to you. It's just to let you know that there are a variety of interpretations of it, some more verbose than others. My definition of it is that it's the exchange of information or ideas between 2 or more people to more positively influence the perceived outcome of a situation or a transaction. The 2 key points there, I think, are the aim is always to get a more positive outcome. So people don't enter into negotiation with the aim of getting a worse outcome. It's always to have a better position than where they started, so that they already have something in common. The other is that it's the perceived value of that outcome to that individual. The perception is their reality. So we have to give just as much weight to what they perceive as what the reality is. And I know Monica and Diana are definitely going to be talking about perception and existentialism, and we'll talk about that briefly in a moment as well. And then there are 2 types of bargainers, 2 types of negotiators. Typically, there's a bit of gray in everything, but most typically there are 2 types. The first one is a principled bargainer. So this is a negotiator who will rely on more objective standards. They will cite precedents, facts, and figures. They will really try to use reason and logic as much as possible. And this is also referred to as integrative bargaining. The contrast to that is a positional bargainer, a positional negotiator. And this is somebody who will assert a position based on their personal belief system. Their agenda may be personal. So they will be more intransigent. They will be more stubborn, more willful. And it can be usually a lack of experience. It could be that they know they have a lack of leverage. It can also be just insecurity. And we'll talk about how security and insecurity features in that. Equally, there are two types of negotiation. So we've looked at the negotiators. Now we're going to look at the two types of negotiation. Again, typically there's a little bit of gray in in most things, but understanding these two types helps you as a mediator to understand the people that you're supporting. It helps you in those pre-mediation discussions to understand what is their end goal. You must ask these questions and plan in advance because it will help you to help them navigate the actual negotiation. So there is a win-lose type of deal making, which we call value claim deal making. These are usually used for one-time only transactions or engagements. So it focuses on positional bargaining, which is the more willful agenda-based bargaining. Variables in this type of negotiation are limited. What do I mean by that? In a negotiation, there is usually one and then a few other variables that will come into play in that negotiation, whether it's money, time, resources, and so forth. In a one-time only negotiation, that will be really limited, which means your ability to leverage will be limited. And so the types of negotiations I'm talking about here are buying a car, maybe buying a house. You might be at a street market and you're bartering with a street merchant, and it will be a one-time deal. There will be no expectation that you have a relationship beyond that, okay? And there's a place for these types of deal making, but you wouldn't typically see that in a corporate negotiation or family negotiation. The reason for that is because those relationships need to be maintained later, okay? And so those types of negotiations are considered value create, win-win type of negotiations, but we call it a value create negotiation. This focuses on mutual outcomes. And if you remember when we were talking about the definition of negotiation, it's where both parties are looking for a more favorable outcome. So they're looking at mutuality. Where can they both come away with something? And it also relies on an investment in the relationship after the negotiation. So if you think about corporate negotiations where you might have an employee or an employer relationship that needs to be mediated, really critical that they are able to work together later. Likewise, in a family mediation, very particularly where you have children, absolutely critical that you are investing in the right way in that negotiation so that there's ground to work with afterwards. Same for a business deal or neighbors. You can't just pick up your house and move it somewhere else. So all of these examples are examples of where you would have a value create negotiation, okay? Then if we think about the framework for, conceptually, the framework for a negotiation, just had a pop-up there, sorry. I just want to talk about how this typically works because it's important to keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the lesson. There's some terms also that will appear in your glossary, and I just want to cover them briefly here. So this is a conceptual diagram of what a negotiation looks like in play. So you will typically have a positioning of two or more people working toward a center point. The center point is the thing that they are negotiating. And at that center point, you can see here, we've got a couple of acronyms. So there's an MDO, which is the most desired outcome. So that's the thing that the individuals want the most. And then on the outside of, this is what I call the playing field, because it to me, it has always looked like a playing field with end goals. And there's a more detailed example of this in the appendices, but I think this does the job well enough. So at the end, on the backside of the play zone there, you have the LDOs, which is the least desired outcomes. So as the parties are entering into negotiation, they will both be maneuvering towards the center point, their most desired outcome. The LDO will be behind them. That's their least desired outcome, and they want to stay as far away from that as possible, conceptually. Now, it's important that you discuss this with the parties that you're supporting through mediation for a couple of reasons. The MDO is critical. You need to know what it is they're after. What is it that they haven't been able to resolve for themselves? What is that thing? Is it a value? Is it a piece of property? Is it a title to something? Whatever that might be. And then equally, you need to understand their LDO. The LDO is just as critical as the MDO, because if for any reason the negotiation and the iteration moves backwards, they must understand what their least desired outcome is and that they don't go any further than that. So if the thing that they're negotiating is particularly of commercial value, their LDO needs to have a walk-away point. Okay, so that's important that you set that in the negotiation. For the most part, effective negotiation will help to move the parties towards the zone of mutual agreement, which is the center point, the ZOMA, as we refer to it. This is where you get most fertile ground. That's where the negotiation will speed up. You will have the most activity once they're in that zone of mutual agreement, and you'll be able to recognize it by some of the commentary and the words that are used as they enter into that. Any questions on this part? I know it's conceptually, it may be a bit foreign, but sound okay so far? Everybody still with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So in this first part, we also want to just briefly talk about the psychology of negotiation. And I say briefly because this is a whole conference in itself. And Diana and Monica, I know, will absolutely cover this in detail over the course of the program. It's part of the backbone of mediation. There are three theories in psychology that I personally believe, and I have seen and studied and experienced over the years, that when woven into the negotiation will give you the best outcomes. And so it's important that you take a little bit of time to really understand what these are. And a couple of you, I think, already have experience of psychology or maybe therapists yourself, so this will be totally familiar to you. But I just want to share with you, I think these are the primary areas that I think really add value in understanding the conflict. So we have existentialism, and this is looking at the person's worldview, their response to existential events, the value that they place on these. And there are some examples of what those existential feelings are under the column that says key focus or theme. And as I go through the next two, you will see there's some commonality between all three, and I'll summarize it in just a moment. And then we move on to the theory of attachment and secure base, pioneered by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And this is a very, very chunky topic, and I would not do it justice well, but I want to really touch on it because the ability to recognize a person's behavior under pressure and their ability to hold discomfort and ambiguity in particular will tell you a lot about that individual. And so taking the time to study a little bit around attachment theory, which talks about an individual's ability to attach themselves to individuals, but also attach in a situation. And it's something that spans their childhood through adulthood. it will really give you some good insights about how well or not they will cope through a negotiation. So people that have secure attachments and are able to cope with ambiguity, real discomfort, will be able to better navigate, will be able to better process a negotiation than somebody who has attachment issues or attachment disorders. Okay. And then finishing just with person-centered theory. And this is work chiefly developed by Carl Rogers and others that focuses on the individual's need to feel validated, need to have recognition and acknowledgement for their circumstance. It's recognizing the need for positive regard, unconditional positive regard, and it's there to help develop the relationship between a therapist and their client. But it also has a place in negotiation when you think about the engagement with the other and validation of the other and having empathy in that situation. Okay, so again, snapshots, bite-sized view of these theories, but please do take the time to read about them. And I know Monica and Diana will cover these in greater detail as well over the program. Any questions on that piece? Okay, so that's the end of segment 1. And just some takeaway points there about why negotiation is important in mediation and your ability to understand it. I'm going to pause for a moment if anybody wants to discuss or any questions about that segment. How is this resonating so far? Does this make sense?
Yeah. Everybody's very quiet. Maybe there's a lot
Very quiet.
taking. Yeah.
Lunch was good, I think.
I think I would struggle to try to understand someone's attachment type in the context of the beginning of a mediation.
Of attachment theory?
Well, no, just in general, trying to, the limited time you've got, trying to understand what type of person you're dealing with. I think I would struggle with.
So we're gonna talk a little bit more about picking up on some nonverbal cues, and I know Diana's going to cover that as well. But there are a few ways that you can get to know the individuals. If I understand your question correctly, you're trying to better understand how you would identify how that person reacts, or if they're attached or not. Was that your question? Yeah. So and I'll just try and answer it briefly, but there's a bit more to it. The best thing to do is to try and establish some rapport before the actual mediation. And the same is true for any negotiation, because you want to establish their behavior, their character, their type of personality, especially if you're the mediator. I think if you're actually the person doing the negotiation, it's slightly different. If you're the mediator, you have a different set of responsibilities supporting individuals as they go through mediation, which is a form of negotiation. And negotiation will absolutely occur in that. If you're the mediator, it's really important that you take some time before the mediation to meet with the parties and get to understand them as an individual and what has led up to this conflict. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a second. The conflict is usually far deeper than we realize. So the item that's being disputed is the superficial element of it. The actual conflict comes down to what's happened to them as an individual. What have they experienced? What existential event has triggered this crisis? Whether it's loss, well, it's typically loss, or other type of event. And in getting to know them and spending some time, whether it's on the phone or face to face, and I think we would all recommend face to face is always optimal. So video would be the minimum default, I think, if you couldn't meet in person. Gives you different clues and indications of where that person is at. And you then have to try and calibrate that information over a period of time. So you're not going to get all of that in one meeting. So it's important that you have a chance to talk to them a couple of times before the actual mediation. And then during the mediation, you will also gather some of that information, and it will tell you a little bit about where they're coming from. It's not going to say definitively this is somebody that's suffering an attachment disorder, but it will also give you enough information that I think you can start to put reasonable observations together to say this is somebody who's really uncomfortable in ambiguity, really uncomfortable without control, and struggles with strife. And you can relay that back to different types of attachment theory. And it's just a tool. You don't want to base your entire support of that mediation on just that one theory. It's more to say that theories such as attachment theories, secure base theories, really have a place in mediation as they do in negotiation, because in an individual's ability to translate a conflicted solution or a conflicted scenario into a solution is going to draw on those feelings and those experiences. It's probably a very long-winded answer, but does that help at all? We're going to talk a little bit more about some of that as we go through, and it might help to explain. There's a tremendous book that connects the dots so well, and it's called Hostage at the Table, and it's written by George Kohlreiser, and he's got a couple of chapters in there on attachment disorder. Probably the best writing that I've seen outside of John Bowlby's own books, and beautifully to negotiation. And I would recommend it as a resource if you want to read more about that. I'll keep going. Okay. So we're going to talk briefly about, so I've mentioned just a few minutes ago, but the mediator's role during negotiation. So, and this isn't hard and fast. These are just some suggestions based on my own experiences, and also trying to make sure that you have a sense of where mediation and negotiation converge and where you can help the individuals going through the negotiation, because they won't be rocking up to the mediation as a seasoned negotiator. They're not expected to be. And so they will need some support. So they'll be looking to you as the mediator, whether they realize it or not, to try and help guide some of these things. And it's important that you as a mediator can also spot and pick up when the negotiation has actually started, so that you can give them some support, ask the right amount of questions, acknowledge trades when they're being offered, acknowledge concessions when they're being offered. And I don't necessarily mean overtly, but encourage the exchange of information and encourage the dialogue when you can see that the negotiation has started. Okay. So I just put there some do's and don'ts to consider. Again, it's nothing hard and fast. You will be your own best judge in that environment as you grow as a mediator and you become experienced in this space. And you will have a lot of support, in particular if you decide to co-mediate. But some suggestions there, just to make sure that, again, you understand the objectives and you're really clear about their MDO and LDO, so their most desired outcome, their least desired outcome, and you're staying within those two poles, that you're helping them with the pace, the feeling in the room, that it's a secure place for people to talk, and that you're calibrating behaviors and body language, that you're providing validation. Things to try to avoid, not overtly getting involved in the deal making itself. Try to avoid ignoring when the individuals are in the ZOMA, in the zone of mutual agreement, and the exchange of offers is happening. It's important that you hear it, because the individuals in that moment are often feeling a lot of emotions and they may not hear it. So it's important to be the extra set of eyes and ears. And then the others, I think, are self-explanatory. Any questions on that one? I'm going to talk very briefly about body language. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail because I know Diana's going to cover this. The main thing I want to offer here is, I think, just a couple of takeaways. The first one is just to point out on the right-hand side there that negotiating in a virtual world is becoming, more and more prevalent, whether it's through email or over Zoom or what have you. And I don't want to dismiss the effectiveness of doing that. I think a lot of people believe that you can really only be successful if you're negotiating in person. And, I think COVID probably proved that wrong for a lot of people, but we know that you can be just as effective negotiating in email and through virtual conference if you're using the right language, and if you're acknowledging and validating and applying some of the principles that we've just discussed and covered. And don't underestimate the value of emotion in email and in virtual conferences, because it will serve you well. Emotion is really valuable. The other takeaway is just that center bit. So I'm not going to go through the nonverbal cues. The main thing I want to impress upon is that there's a lot of study in the world of body language and what it means and what it doesn't mean. The important thing is that you don't take it at face value on the first indication or the first cue. Okay, please don't do that and put your whole theory on it. Don't bank on it. What you want to do instead is measure it in clusters and then interpret what does that mean. And these are called gesture clusters, which is very hard to say fast. But there are 3 types of gesture clusters there. And they give you some valuable information back if you have observed a clustering of these types of cues happening in a particular space of time. Okay, so just have a think about that and make sure that you understand that the key to the body language is calibrating it in the right way. Okay, and then it will have some good meaning for you. Any questions on that slide? No. With most of you?
I have a quick question. is this something you would actually mention? Like if you notice something that's a bit off in someone's body language?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Really great question. And we're going to talk about tactics and counter tactics in just a moment. But if it repeats and it's repeating and Monica and Diana, I would welcome your comments here as well. My experience is that if it repeats and it's a cue that's detrimental, and the person is doing it and it's having a negative reaction, either for that individual where they're representing themselves in a negative way, or for the group and the negotiation itself, I would absolutely call it out. But you need to be gentle and you need to be careful about how you call it out.
Right.
And you do that in a way which is to just observe it. And you reflect on what you've seen. So it might be that if you've got an individual who's sitting far back and everything is crossed, the arms are crossed, the ankles are crossed, there's very little eye contact, you can absolutely interpret from that. And if it's happening over a period of time in that session, they are definitely sending a signal. There's tension, there's upset, and you don't want to let it go. That would be the wrong thing to do. But you've got to make sure you don't do it on the first cue, because that could totally backfire, and you could have totally gotten it wrong. It might just be that they're sitting back because they've got a backache, as we were talking about earlier, and they're just in discomfort. But if they've got that together with a clustering of other cues and it's happening over a period of time in that session, it's important that you observe that. I'll let Diana and Monica say something here because I know you'd.
No, I agree that the parties are communicating with you on all levels. This is why I personally don't like Zoom or something else, because you've only got so much of a person. I might be sitting here looking very calm, at the same time I might be tapping my foot, feeling totally irritated. When you've got people in the room, I think it's fine to remember that they're communicating with you all in all their different senses, and so consciously or unconsciously they're offering them to us. And to ignore them is perhaps disrespectful. So if I was noticing any repetitive body language, that I wouldn't assume it meant anything. So this is the danger, in a way, of saying this particular gesture means X, because as Kelly was saying, it doesn't always. But I would say I've noticed that you've done this a number of times, and I'm wondering what you would like me to take from that. What is it that maybe I'm not helping you to express verbally? What is it that's being expressed through your body that we haven't actually been able to say in the session? So that's the way I would work with it. Diana, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree very much. And I really liked it, Kelly, when you said, hang on, these theories, they're very generalized, and don't be too quick off the mark in interpreting body language, but wait, give it time until you get to know the context, the person, and I think then, as Monica says, and as you're saying, it's a form of expression, and I think it's important not to again jump to conclusions, but really address the person, put it back to see what is being expressed, in an accepting way, not in a kind of, so when you say, you have to be sensitive, very much so, and I think that it's because we cannot still, we have a hunch what it might mean, but I think there's always this checking out, see what it means, and whatever the answer is, if the person says, no, I'm fine, well, okay, we back off again. So I really like that, Kelly, and I think we're all on the same page.
Good. And thank you for the question, Melvin. It was a really good question. And just finishing this segment with some takeaways on how to spot a deal in progress. So this is just looking and hearing signals that the negotiation has started, that the parties are either just on the cusp or heading into the zone of mutual agreement. And a lot of people speculate about the benefit of who starts a negotiation. Some people could argue that the negotiation starts the second you sit down. And I really think that that has a bearing on where things go from there from the very beginning. But you really start to see the materiality of the negotiation once exchanges start to occur, and then you can hear the iteration. So it doesn't necessarily matter who starts. And there's some other terms there that you can read about, the BATNA, which is your best alternative to that deal. And also having a sense of your boldness factor, which is a model that's covered in the appendices as well. Tradables are important, and it's important as the mediator to discuss these and understand what's being sought through the mediation. So they will have their most desired outcome, but there are things that are variable around that outcome. And those variables may give the parties some concessions. And so it's important to try and ask about those because you want to try and get the individuals to a good enough outcome where both parties have a more positive outcome. You get into the mutuality of it. And I know Monica and Diana will definitely talk about that more. Recognizing when you're in the ZOMA, as I've discussed, and then when to eject, as I call it. And in mediation, and this is probably where the two are slightly different. In mediation, there is sometimes a view that you just keep going. You will keep going until you reach agreement. And sorry, there's a fly. And there is a lot of mileage in that. And you can probably get the right outcomes in doing that. In negotiation, there's a stopping point. And the stopping point is when you're hovering around your least desired outcome and you're about to go beyond your least desired outcome. That is an absolute signal that things have gone in the wrong direction and you need to be really cautious. And so you want to be careful in supporting your clients, your parties in negotiation, that they don't go too far. So, because it could cost them, and you want to make sure that they know where their ejection point is. And it doesn't mean that you don't reconvene. Okay, that's not at all what we mean. It's not, when we say walk away point, it isn't literally you leave the building and get in your car. It is, time out. I need to pause, I need to reflect, I need to regroup. And as a mediator, you'll want them to continue and try and solve the conflict. And so that ejection point is really a time for pause and to reconsider what they're after and whether or not they can continue on that day, or maybe they need to continue on another day. And then recognizing if you've got a deal in hand. Sometimes people are so emotional, they don't realize that the thing that they've been after has been offered. It will go, because they are so worked up over something, they will completely miss it. And that in itself is worth examining and understanding. And I'll leave that to Diana and Monica to break down, and I know that they will in the program over the next few days, but that's something to be mindful of. I'm gonna hurry along here because I think I'm really overrunning. Okay, I'm going to motor on to part 3. So this is a short segment, but and the last segment, and I just want to make sure that we cover it. So just talking briefly about conflict and the true sense of conflict for an individual, and then just very briefly how to deal with dirty tactics in negotiation. And I credit Paul Randolph for really helping me to understand and make the connection between the psychology of negotiation and mediation and the power of validation and how that influences positive outcomes. And there's some information there about Paul Randolph, who was one of the founders at the Regents program and also an author, and wrote a fantastic book on the psychology of conflict. But I just want to spend a moment on this sphere here. So, and I know Monica and Diana will talk about peeling back the onion, and that conflict has a lot of layers. And so you could say this looks like an onion. Some people would say it looks like a jawbreaker if you're from the part of the world that I'm from. But I see conflict in a spherical sense, in that typically they come into the conflict with a very clear view of what the issue is. They will tell you, they will probably want to tell you for a long time what that issue is. And really, I think the experience in the study there shows that is symptomatic of the bigger conflict. And I know that the program that you're going through right now is really going to cover that in great detail, but just be aware that surface level issue is not actually the conflict. And it's only through your studying and your experience, your accreditation that you're getting, that you're able to confidently start to peel back some of those layers. And you need to do it cautiously as well, I would say, that you're going to see and experience that individual's worldview, their existential view of the world, what that means to them. And in discussing that with them, getting to know them a little bit in the lead up to the mediation, that you will get to the true conflict. And if you don't get to that, you will struggle, I think, in supporting them through the mediation. And then if we look at how negotiation, mediation, and more recently restorative justice come together, they all kind of overlap. If we were to stack them on top of each other, they have commonality in, I think, 2 key areas. And I mention these 3 because I believe they are the most effective forms of conflict resolution. They all have an aim of mutuality, where both parties come away in a better position. And they all have validation in their center. And it's the combination of those 2 and rapport building within that, which I know you're going to cover in this program, that will give you the best benefit and will give you, I think, the most positive outcomes for your clients and the parties that you're supporting. And just to finish, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think for as much as the preceding slides look to give you some tools and resources to make the negotiation more effective, it's also important to look at things that can be counter effective, and can be actually destructive in a negotiation. Because sometimes, depending on the nature of the negotiation, whether it's a family mediation, corporate mediation, sometimes people will be underhanded, and it may be that they are behaving in a detrimental way on accident. Although Freud would argue nothing is on accident, but it may be that they subconsciously behave in a certain way that is destructive. Whereas you could also be supporting individuals in a mediation that are seasoned negotiators, or they may have brought people into the mediation that are seasoned negotiators, and they will use these tools to undermine the deal making. So it's important that we're not naive about that, and you're able to recognize these tactics so that you can counter them. And so I'm just going to pick out a couple and talk about them very briefly. So starting with silence. So silence is a really powerful tool, and it can be a very negative tactic in certain situations if used repeatedly. This again goes back to the need to calibrate and observe the frequency in which some of these things occur. But if somebody uses silence in a mediation, very long pause, or if they're doing this over email or phone calls where they're just ignoring, and it's happening repeatedly, that's a message. That's a tactic that somebody is using either to avoid or to take back some power. So you want to consider how that's affecting the negotiation in the bigger context, right? And that's true for all of these. You don't take it just at face value. You want to take it in context of the negotiation and the people that are involved in the negotiation. How do you counter the silence? If it happens once, you do nothing. You just observe it and you keep going. If it happens multiple times and it's over a space of time, concentrated space of time, you do want to mention it. You want to call it out. And depending on the type of mediation, you may say, are you going quiet on me? And you could be gentle and maybe use it as a bit of humor. Or you can say, I've observed that, or I'm feeling that. And then you say the rest, so that it gives you an opportunity to talk about it, because there could be something in that. There could be more behind the negotiation than you realize. Another one is intimidation. So intimidation is unfortunately a very common tactic in negotiation, particularly in corporate deal making. And mediation is becoming more and more popular in dispute resolution for companies. And this can take the form of, physical intimidation. Somebody might stand up and, kick the chair back or stomp out of the room, and really exert presence, physical presence. It could be gender or sexist based intimidation, which we saw in the 80s and 90s. And if you think about the old boardroom style type deal making. Cultural intimidation, where you have two very different cultures trying to work through a negotiation or mediation. And there's an overt need or an overt desire to ignore the cultural norms of the other person or to be respectful of them. And so in all cases, again, you take it in context, you take it in its frequency. If it's happening repeatedly, you need to stop that. You need to knock it on its head. And the best way to do that, and Monica and Diana will cover this with you, the best way to do that is to pause. Just pause the mediation, take a break, regroup, and that gives you time to consider what's happened there and whether or not it's so extreme, or it could be so offensive to the other parties that mediation is not the appropriate mode of conflict resolution here, and that could happen. Or it could be something that needs to be unpacked and needs to be discussed. And then you make sure that the parties are safe and okay, and then you would reconvene and discuss it. What you wouldn't do is be silent about it. I'm just going to pause there to see if Monica and Diana want to add anything to that.
No, I think you know, you covered it really. Whether you don't have to pause it, again, it's all a judgment call, and you might do different when you're in a one-to-one as in a group in the joint session. So we'll show you through the role plays that we actually do, because it's easier to kind of show how that happens. Because you have to be very careful not to put one party down in front of the other party.
Mhm.
If their behaviour is such that you need to address it, then you've got to find quite a gentle way of closing it off and talking to them about it. If you put them down in any way, then you've changed the dynamic from being a neutral mediator, and you've got to be very careful about that.
Yes.
So you can't ignore it, but you've got to think very carefully and not to do the, we're not having it. You can't say that here, because that's not a mediation way of doing it.
Yeah.
You've got to explore, you know, a little bit, what were you trying to achieve by saying that? Let me understand a bit more why that was necessary to say. What was the intended outcome? And you wouldn't do that in front of the other party.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And the last one I'll mention is salami slicing. And this is a really common tactic in corporate negotiations, but also something that can start to happen and you can observe it, and it might feel a bit like a phenomena, but it is usually purposeful. And salami slicing is when you have one party offering up a number of smaller tradables over the period of the negotiation. And typically, if they start offering these early in the negotiation or in the mediation, that's your first kind of clue that this might be an attempt to coerce the direction of the deal making. Because if you understand well enough in the beginning what the MDOs are for the parties, the most desired outcomes, if they are offering up smaller, less valuable tradables frequently and early, you have to question the motive a bit there. And it could genuinely be nervousness, and they're just desperate to get the deal agreed, and they're just going to offer anything. I would suggest that's probably not the case, because if that's the case, they wouldn't have needed mediation. They would have been able to resolve the conflict by then. So it's more likely that it's a tactic, and they do that as a feigned gesture of repeated goodwill in expectation that the other party will then accept those and let go of their MDO. So what you want to do, and what is best really for both parties, is to hear it, acknowledge it, and not accept it immediately. So if they're making, here's your MDO, here's a little tradable, here's another little tradable, another little tradable. It could be that the party says, okay, and then I would be very fearful of that, because that means that the individual that you're helping through the mediation has just jumped and totally forgotten about what they were there for. And you want to unpack that and understand why that is. But I would encourage them to just hear what's happening. And then when they're in that zone of mutual agreement, that's when typically you would have a healthy degree of negotiation and exchanging. But you will know more when you're in the negotiation and you've calibrated the way that person works. If they're a really calm, centered person, they seem to be coping well with stress and ambiguity, and then they suddenly jump at the very first offer, something doesn't stack up there. So those are the observations you would want to make. And as Monica was saying, you would want to unpack that gently, neutrally, and in an observing way, so that it gives you some ground to talk about it. And that was my last slide. I'm going to stop there because I've totally overrun. Just ask if you've got any questions, if any of that resonated, or more so if it felt foreign. And yeah.
I thought it made a lot of sense, really. Thank you.
Good. I promised I said 2 books that I would highly recommend that cover negotiation or conflict, psychology in conflict. This one, which is George Kohlreiser's Hostage at the Table. Excellent, excellent book. This one.
And I haven't bribed her.
From yours truly, not me truly, Monica. And she's produced some amazing books actually in a short space of time. But there are others also in the appendices. If you want
the book title "Their Hostage at the Table" is interesting because I have known in my counselling situation where when people are trying to force a conversation with a partner, they wait till they're in a car driving along.
Yeah.
So that the person is absolutely forced to listen. It's a terrible tactic to use, but people do it quite a lot.
They do.
And it doesn't get you anywhere.
No, I kind of call that being marooned. You're marooned and stuck in a place that you, like on an island, and you can't get off, and then you're forced into those conversations, as you say. But yeah, a very interesting book to read. But there are a good few others that I would recommend from the reading list. Monica and Diana, is there anything else you would like me to cover, or any other questions that I can answer?
Thank you so much, Kelly. I mean, we've taken up a lot of your time, not just today, but also in all the work you've done preparing for this. And there's such a lot of material, and we will be throughout the course to link to and from. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Kelly. I was wondering, do we have this material?
Today you should have been sent it with your pack.
Yeah.
If you sent it with your PowerPoints.
Yeah.
No.
If anybody's not got it, then please let us know, but it was.
Oh dear, I sent all the PowerPoint. Oh, Monica, you sent the PowerPoint, didn't you? Yeah.
This is the last page with all the extra reading suggestions. But yeah, you should have the material. There's some extra slides at the back with some other models to look at.
Got a slightly different front cover. So it's got a very large compass, and it's got the logo of the course on, but the material in it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
You say you sent it at the outset, Monica.
Yes.
Under what was the heading? Because I don't have.
You should have had an email that says day 2, and it will have all the PowerPoints from today on it. If you haven't, just contact me and I'll resend them.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, you had a question.
Yeah, sorry, I just I was trying to form it. It was just about the relative position of power of both parties coming into a negotiation, because in corporate life, it's obvious one company is bigger than the other. But I wonder how that relates to any form of mediation. There's always somebody who is potentially wronged by the other party. It's not. How do you maintain balance within the negotiation, knowing that outside the negotiation, in fact, the two parties are very unequal?
I think I'll have a go, and then Monica, if you want to jump in as well. My experience and my training over the years has taught me that it doesn't matter who comes in with more. They're both there because they need something. And the scale of that thing is less important than their needs. And if you can get to the heart of what they need and acknowledge what's happened, whether it's almost always loss of something, then you can work through that toward the thing that they need. So I think you have to try and park the size of the party or the material aspects of one party over the other, and try to focus instead on what the needs are of that individual, validating what they've experienced, having empathy for what they've been through, and start to peel back the onion layers. Or does that answer your question, or were you talking about just in a sense of being maybe intimidating to the other party?
No, I think it does, because if I've heard you correctly, both parties wouldn't be in the negotiation or mediation with a mediator had one side already been able to bludgeon its way through and just force its opinion on the other. So the fact that they're actually at the mediation means that they are taken as equal parties in the room. That's what I heard anyway. They both want something.
Yes, and I'm also looking at it from two different types of mediation, and I should have mentioned that maybe a bit earlier, but I have experience of joint mediation where the parties are together, and then one-on-one mediation where they're separate. And that has a whole kind of different bearing on it. But the principles are the same. Did you want to say something on that, Monica?
Yeah, I think we've got to be really careful, going back to what we talked about before in terms of phenomenology and bracketing things, that what on paper can look like a power dynamic where one person is clearly more powerful than the other or one institution is. In terms of the debate and the conflict, that power dynamic might be reversed. Mm-hmm. So you can very often, get pre-material and you'll think this looks like the victim and this looks like the perpetrator, for want of better words. And this is where the power lies. And it may be completely different from what it looks like on the surface. Mm-hmm. And the power might lay with somebody outside of the mediation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, never assume that the party that seems the most powerful in any way is. Yeah. It will come out during the dialogue where the power lies, and then you have to work with that power dynamic, but don't assume what it might be from the beginning, because you could be very wrong. So true. And that actually makes me think of another great book, which is on the list there, from Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you've heard of him, but his book, David and Goliath, talks about that specific issue, where there's perceived power in different exchanges with people, whether it's a negotiation or any type of relationship building, and how that can often be reversed, and how misconceptions can play out. But it's a really, really great question, because it makes you pause and think, and as Monica says, really emphasizes the need for bracketing going into it.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we lose Kelly? Give her her time back, the rest of her Saturday.
No, not as such, but it's helpful to have the presentation just to read up a bit later, because it's quite a lot to take in.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I wish you great success over your course. it's an exciting time ahead for you. So enjoy, and I will speak with you soon.
Thank you very
Here.
much. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Just have to figure out how to shut this off.
No, how not.
Okay. Bye.